Oh, yeah. Yeah, I could have sent you Zoom and then you didn't have to download it. You can just link onto it.
Oh, should have done it. Is that what you're using? Is Zoom? Is that the big one to use now?
Yeah, yeah, that one, Zoom or Blue Jeans, they're about the same.
Blue jeans? That sounds very hip for you, Corey. All of a sudden now you sound like one of the kids.
Well, I try to be more youthful in my approach.
Oh, does that work for you?
Oh, absolutely.
Hey, everybody. Todd Conklin, Pre-Accident Investigation. How are you today? Good? I don't know. I don't know if good is a word we can even use anymore. It is, it's time to come together for a big podcast. And this is a special podcast, of course, because all the podcasts I have lined up, which are all really good, and you'll get to hear them all. Don't worry. I'm not keeping it any. Well, some have gone away, actually. So some I won't play for you, probably. They're all changing. And it's because the world is just so dramatically changing. It's hard to keep up. I mean, it's the pace of change around crisis is always remarkable. And you can really see where uncertainty drives just lots of very quick judgments. It's tough because you can't really call them rash judgments because you want to make quick decisions that have potentially long-term impacts. But if you don't make the decision quick, then it's too late. The most interesting thing I'm learning, and I'm learning a ton through this, you guys, a ton, is that response to a crisis always feels like overkill before and underkill afterwards. So wherever you are in the scheme of the event impacts whether you're over-responding in pre-spect or whether you under-responded in retrospect. And you can really see where, well, there's two things that I think are vital, at least in my thinking. I'd be curious what you're thinking too. One is that there really is a choice between blame and improvement. One takes you backwards, the other moves you forward. And I've talked about that for pretty much my whole career, but you can really see it when you watch how governments and states and provinces and regions respond to failure, that looking backwards in blame really does fix nothing. Looking forward allows you the opportunity to look towards improvement. And that means some decisions are made quickly. What it really tells me between you and I is the power of having the ability to be agile and adaptive, to experiment, to try things at small scale in order to get a fast data set by which you can use then to maybe multiply to a larger data set. And all of you guys that listen to this podcast, and there's a whole bunch of you that are having to make these very, very, very quick, very important decisions, are processing this information just as fast as I am as well. And it's crazy. I don't even know what to think. My heart is breaking for the workers and people who are going without just because, at no fault of their own, this uncertainty struck, and it struck a system that's just not very capacity filled. And you can really see that with healthcare, really globally. You can see it with healthcare. You especially see it in the United States. And it's something to behold. And it's frightening. And it's scary. And these little daily virus casts I'm doing, those have been helpful, at least in making me think about things that I should learn every day in order to share them with you. I don't know if they're good or not. I'm not sure the arbiter of good or bad will happen now. It'll happen later. But I do know that they provide us an opportunity to think about really how we do our work and what things like capacity, what do those words actually mean to us? Because those are pretty interesting words when we talk about them in the macro and when we talk about them in sort of the theoretic. But when you actually bring them to application like you guys are doing every single day, you really see where you had capacity and where you did not have capacity. I mean, it's almost painfully obvious. And I can tell you the things that are recovering well because there was enough tolerance and capacity in the system to manage a pretty relatively significant intervention, a big, big poop full of uncertainty, and to roll out of it and recover. And you're seeing things like you guys in the grocery business. Man, I can't even imagine how much further your systems are taxed right now. And for those of you guys that have production in place right now, you're really seeing probably some pretty big pushes on the edge of that production. But I bet you're seeing something else too. I bet you're seeing less deference towards rules and more deference towards problem solvers. It's really interesting when uncertainty happens, the first thing that goes out the door are rules. And there's a lesson for us in that. Absolutely, there's a lesson for us in that. And it's a lesson we ought to be learning. That's for sure, right? So let's break into the podcast. So here's the backstory on this podcast. So Jeff Lith had a Vancouver human performance workshop, a 3-day workshop scheduled, and it's been canceled because everything's being canceled because no one can travel. That makes sense. We know why. We understand the background on that. And one of the days, it was going to be myself and Corrie Pitzer. And I love Corrie, and I don't get to spend near enough time with him. We see the world very differently, but that makes us more interesting to each other, not less interesting. And so we had done a podcast promoting this workshop. And Corrie got in and started talking about his new work he's doing around fatalities. And it was a great podcast. The problem is that when we canceled the workshop, I couldn't use the podcast anymore because it's not going to happen. So the podcast would be a giant waste of time. So I thought, well, what am I going to do? I guess I'll scrap that podcast because that's what I'm going to have to do. But I didn't want to scrap the conversation with Corrie. And I thought, well, I can't really pull the conversation out. So I just called Corrie and said, hey, you want to do another one? And he said, sure. So earlier this week, we picked up and got on Skype and did a little podcast. And that's what I'm going to share with you. Now, the important thing for us is to support one another, to be kind, and to help each other. And I'm so proud of all the things that are going on right now. Andrew Barrett's doing this open office hours via the web. You're seeing real strong communities being built lots of places in order to create an environment where, well, we can support one another. And that's really valuable. That's kind of what this conversation is with Corrie. Couple friends in the midst of a crisis talking about what happened. Oh, my God, what happened? And more importantly, oh, my God, what's next? So without further ado, let me just pop into the conversation, and you can listen to Corrie and Todd on the Pre-Accident Podcast. Stay strong, you guys. Be kind to each other and keep moving forward. I'll talk to you at the end. Well, since we're not gonna clearly get to do our workshop, which makes me so sad, and we had this great podcast that I wanted to put up, I guess I wanted to touch base with you and see what you're thinking about all this COVID-19 thing and how it's impacting what you're doing and what you're thinking. What's going on in your world?
Yeah, obviously quite a serious impact in a lot of ways. I just returned from United Kingdom and last week, and so I, doing the 14-day isolation here, but and then everything that was planned for the next month and a half now is already all been cancelled, and so we have to adjust quite a bit. But we were actually quite prepared, not for this, but for a different. We were looking at putting our whole business a lot more on online and through webinars and through the web, and I've done quite a bit of preparation for that and setups and so on. And so we're actually really well set up now to switch over. So, and here comes the virus,
What did that preparation look like? What are you thinking about doing differently?
Well, we are thinking about doing coaching, more online coaching. We are splitting up our training programs into modules that we will do through Zoom. And through online sessions, and split it up in smaller modules. Like we used to have a day session, we'll do it over 2 or 3 days, or two or 3 days spread out over a couple of weeks or something like that.
As a safety professional, What's your feeling on this pandemic? I guess maybe a better question would be, what's your feeling on organizations' reaction to this pandemic? What are you seeing?
I'm seeing a heavy, diligent reaction from organizations that, the ones I'm dealing with, where they've gone into quick modes of splitting teams up into green teams and red teams and or blue teams and green teams, and they operate alternatively. The top teams have been split up fairly early on and started to ensure that they can actually manage the process more lean, but also with less social interaction. A lot of that is done, I think, fairly early in the piece. And the company that I was in London with started off very well with that. And the problem is, of course, out there in the workplaces where the actual work is being done. They have to have interactions there, and the productions are going. But I think overall the reaction of companies were very progressive and diligent.
Has it changed the way safety functions?
I think it does. It will. It probably hasn't yet. At this stage, it's like containment, reaction to the immediate threat. But if you think about long term, I think there's going to be a lot of impact on various levels. And if you think about the process of the controls that are being put in place in a normal situation in an organization, there's a lot of safety happens through interaction, through engagement. The leadership, the way that they spread the message is through personal engagement. All of those things are probably not under threat, but probably eroded. And how will they do it otherwise? So there's going to be more a shift to electronics, to online electronic media, which may very well erode the safety message in the long term from what I can see.
Do you see more division between management and the workforce because of the necessary social distancing that's happening?
I certainly see that as one of the fallouts, but also in teams, on a lateral level. I think the whole drive of safety has been strongly through the social life of it, and the message of being safe, taking care of each other. That's still all possible, but just the simple quantity of interaction must have a slow down effect on that. So, and this is quite fascinating for me because this is all about culture, and how the culture in the organization exists and lives. And there's actually quite I'm just playing with this in my mind at the moment, that the behavior of a virus, and you remember, was it Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, about how, a virus epidemic spread. And I've always thought about that in terms of cultural terms, how a change in culture in organizations spreads like a virus, through strong individuals or connected individuals that sends a different message into the organization, and that starts to shift people's perceptions about the leadership and about safety and so on. So there's this kind of analogy that's starting to become quite interesting for me. Is it similar?
Who's doing it well, and what's that look like?
Doing what well? The response?
Yeah, the response to this, and the mitigated communication, and the cultural intervention, and the communication via electronic media, all that kind of stuff that's kind of normal now. We've been in it a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I don't have a clear handle on an organization as such that is doing it well. At this stage, I think organizations are at this stage scrambling to to manage the process and to almost reacting all the time, and keeping people away from work where they can, etc. So I think the organizations who is going to live through this and be effective in the long term are those who are actually going to manage this whole issue strategically in the organization. To how do they manage the impact on operations, how they manage the impact on people in the business and how they interact. Long term, that's going to be a real challenge. I think things will resettle. This is probably quite a big reset button that's being pressed. But from our field, our perspective in terms of safety, I'm a little bit worried about the impact that it's going to have on our effectiveness as a profession in the long run. And so, which organizations? I think that's still to be, the jury is still out on that, probably.
Do you see it influencing things like fatalities and serious events?
Yeah, I think there may well be that kind of impact. I think I did mention to you this interesting concept that I started to work on in terms of what factors precede in an organization a rise in the likelihood, not in a predictive way, not as a metric, but what kind of factors are influencing that kind of potential for fatal events. And for instance, one of the things that I worry about is the myopic focus of organizations on the events, fatal events that they know about, that is part of their history or part of their industry, and they focus so strongly on the known. This whole virus attack, suddenly opens up. Well, there's a lot unknown in the business, and it's increasingly more unknown because we're having more and more complex operations. So, will this eventually have an impact on safety, on fatal events? I think it, apart from the direct impact, but also in terms of operations, how people function in the business as a whole may erode the controls or the effects we have on fatal prevention.
How much do you think this the notion of resilience matters? Why is South Korea so much different in its response to this virus than, for instance, Italy was?
I'm wondering if it's structural in nature. So I think it's demographics of Italy that looks to me like has played a key role in the whole thing. Especially the northern part of Italy. There's a lot of tourism in that area. There's a lot of older people, and also there's been a lot of people at the early stages. Tourism from China, where the whole thing started, and I think it was uncontrolled for them. But I'm not too sure if it's in the cultures, the resilience in the cultures that makes a difference. I think it's demographics that's and so many variables. I think it's a multifaceted issue that for instance, Africa. Why is Africa so low? And I think people want to quickly say, oh, it's because they use malaria drugs and things like that, which may play a role. But there's so many other factors. There's not a lot of tourism into Africa. There's it's summertime in Africa as compared to winter time. So there's all kinds of physical demographics. I think I'm not too sure resilience is yet playing a role, but certainly. From now on, I think it's going to be quite a question. How resilient is the organizations? How resilient are the economies of the world of the various countries? That's going to be probably a big question.
Well, we started this conversation by you saying because you guys at SafeMap were exploring new ways to deliver your product, you had more capacity than you could have had, maybe than other companies had, for this kind of change. That, I think, is a pretty good definition of resilience, albeit kind of accidental resilience. But
But
you have some
accidental, yeah.
resilience built into your system. What do you think that plays in the overall picture of this strategy?
In our strategy or overall?
Well, I think either's fine. Wherever you think you're the most brilliant.
Sorry, no, I think I missed the question there, Todd.
So you said when we started our conversation, you said that SafeMap had been exploring some alternative ways to deliver your product, and when this happened, it was a pretty easy transition for you to go over. I would suggest that's resilience. That's accidental resilience. I mean, I don't think that was your strategy, but that's a pretty important capacity to have, and you had it, and when you need it, you can tap into it. Are other companies in the same place?
I don't know if other companies are in the same place, but I think they're going to very quickly make that shift. It wasn't difficult for us to make the shift. When we started to change our whole strategy, it was a matter of setting it physically up and starting to think about how do we actually do this differently. So I think organizations are going to have to shift almost out of desperation. And they can do it equally well in the end. And if they do it, whether they do it out of desperation or whether they do it out of a planned process like ours were, I think the opportunities are really open to everybody to come out positively at the other. And as you say, in terms of resilience to me really is built by this adversity and how we respond to it. Is going to be the determining factor. But maybe we should also think about what do we have inherently in our organization? What are the strengths that we inherently have in our business that can take us through to the next step? And so, for instance, one of the things that I was talking to my employees and staff with just yesterday, actually, is how do we utilize this time period in a constructive way? So, for instance, how do we look at how we can actually take our products and push them into this electronic circumstance very quickly? Even though we had progressed in that way, we still have a way to go. But also, we can actually use this time to develop conceptually, more and better concepts in what we're doing, and how we, kind of ideas that we work with. And so that's what I'm busy with quite a bit now, is to see how can I progress conceptually, because I think that's the challenging part of it.
What are your biggest concerns? Or maybe I should ask it this way, Corrie. What's your strategy for when things come back to normal? What are you going to do differently? What have you learned from this? What are you going to take out of this on the side of improvement?
I'm not too sure how we will, other than the streamlining of the process of the methodology, streamlining of the transfer of our knowledge into the clients. We may very well continue on the tack that we were, and that's like, let's push hard for putting our materials over in modular fashion and more interaction through video conferencing and so on. But I think for me the takeaway of this is how we can ready ourselves to respond for these kind of adversities, and not just Corona, the coronavirus, but other smaller adversities that come into line now. Because I think people are going to be more vulnerable. Businesses are going to be more vulnerable. They're going to be, more focused on the bottom line. They're going to have less money to spend on a lot of our materials and concepts are more at the luxury end of safety, if I can put it like that. Doing cultural development and leadership development comes a little bit down the line from ensuring that there's safety processes in place and that their safety controls are effective. And so from that perspective, we have to think how we actually structure our whole approach so that we can not push too far ahead in the more luxury items of safety.
So are you saying you're predicting a swing back towards the more fundamentals, towards the industrial side of safety as an initial response to the transition back?
I think so. I think and as you know, our business has been split into two parts. SafeMap is the more leadership development and more people side of the business, and the other side of SafeMap is called RiskMap, and that's more on the risk management, risk control side of things. And we split it for conceptual reasons. But I think there's going to be more a need for other businesses too, to have a look and ensure that the fundamentals, the foundational side, industrial side, is well managed, and then they can start getting again to a point where they start looking at the more sophisticated levels of it. So yeah, I think there's going to be some level of regression, if you call it regression. It's not regression in negative terms, but to the more foundational side of safety.
So what advice do you have for people? If you could give them advice, you're old and saged and wise. You're one of the great elders that walked the earth, et cetera, et cetera. What advice do you have?
My advice, I'm talking now to people inside a business, managing and running safety in a business. My advice would be to look how quickly can we get back to recapturing the level of safety that we've achieved, the level of sophistication that we've achieved, and take it from there. I think the real challenge is to not lose momentum, and depends on how long this whole process will play out. And if it's a month or two, I think the recapturing will be quick. But it could be that organizations might lose a little bit of wind in the sails because of having to go back and do more basic stuff. That's the one thing, is how quickly can we capture where we've been. The other side of this would be, for me, is how do we actually ensure that the whole social fabric of our business is not damaged by this whole thing, that we don't look upon social distancing as a permanent feature of our world. The closer we are in terms of, and I'm not meaning physically, but physically removal, social distance, physical social distancing leads to more emotional social distancing too. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't see this as the permanent fabric of our society. I mean, we have to work probably harder at messaging to our employees around engagement and the visibility and interaction between leadership, between leader groups, between levels in the organization, so that fabric is actually retained.
I think that's sage advice, man. I think that's really good advice. What would you say? Let me just drop a little turd in the punch bowl. What would you say if I told you, I don't think we're going to re-enter, we're not going to go back to where we came. I think this intervention is so significant, it'll really change us. What do you think?
In what way do you think it'll change us?
I think it's going to change the sort of the social interactions within the organization. It's going to feel different, and it feels different because it probably is different.
Yeah, I absolutely. Coming back to what I said earlier on, I fear it will have a lasting impact in terms of how we've messaged safety and how we've messaged progression in our organizations. Just the whole notion of human interaction as a foundational side of it. It's certainly going to be damaged, but I'm thinking that's going to be our challenge. How quickly can we, maybe not quickly, but how effectively can we recapture what has brought us here? If we are not able to get back to where we are as a society in terms of our whole cultural interaction in normal life, then we've lost the battle in that respect. So this is bigger than anything anybody's ever seen, probably in terms of on the health side of issues. Where this will lead us, I think you're right. It's gonna be different when we start. But how do we ensure that the things that we did well, the things that served us well, are not lost as a result of that?
So that's the pod. What do you think? It's hard not to just go into complete depression and have these horrific worst case scenarios conversations. But I actually think we worked hard not to do that. I did, at least. I appreciate what Corrie's thinking. I also appreciate what you're thinking as well. Let's communicate a lot. I do think the reentry is going to be something we need to strategize and think about. And so we should. Let's do that. Until then, learn something new every single day. Have as much fun as you possibly can. Be kind to each other. And for goodness sakes, be safe.